So, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to ICAS public event on U.S. China trade ties after Trump's and Xi's meeting at the G20. My name is Nong Hong, and I am the Executive Director and Senior Fellow with the Institute for China-American Studies. For some of you who attend our ICAS meeting for the first time, let me just say a few words about our institute. So as an independent think tank based here, the goal of ICAS is to facilitate the exchange of ideas and people between the United States and China. So in order to achieve this goal, we focus our research on key issues in U.S.-China relations in need of greater mutual understanding, especially including the maritime security and strategy and security study in Asia Pacific, among others. So 2018 is certainly no doubt a very critical year and turbulence year to assess the U.S.-China bilateral trade relations. And in that context, we have a research team led by my colleague, Mr. Sourabh Gupta, on working on these trade relations, which product reports, commentary, and policy paper. In late October, we have a public event here talking about the impact of China-U.S. trade conflict on economy growth in China and also in Asian countries. So today, it's a great honor to have three preeminent experts to share with us their views on the outcome of the Xi and Trump meeting at the G20. Let me introduce our speaker, Dr. Mary Lovely is Senior Fellow with Peterson Institute of International Economy, and she's also the Professor of Economics at Syracuse University. And Dr. Ellen Forrest, a Senior Fellow with East-West Center in Washington office, and she was also the counselor to the U.S. Trade Representative in the first Clinton administration. And certainly my colleague, Mr. Sourabh Gupta, and he's our Senior Fellow who writes very substantially on the trade issues and security issues. So Dr. Lovely is going to make a presentation on the outcome of the meeting and also looking into the future. And then Dr. Frost is going to moderate a panel discussion, which is going to be joined by Dr. Lovely and Sourabh. So without further ado, I'm going to invite Dr. Lovely to come to the podium to share your remark.
Do we have the slides? Okay, well, while the smarter, more able people are getting up my slides, I just want to thank the Institute for the invitation. It's wonderful to know you're here, and of course to reunite with my former student from not that many years ago. I have much older students. So it's great you can be here. I think it's a small enough group that we can have a really good conversation, I think. I wish there were more Americans here. I think Americans need to engage on the complexity of the issues. Oftentimes what we hear is sound bites, as if everything is black and white, and that simply is not the case. These are complicated issues that are going to take a lot of creativity and goodwill to actually solve. But I think the goodwill part is the part we have to work on. We have to really work hard to find ways to cooperate, because the failure to do so is simply, the cost is unthinkable. So I call my presentation today Turbulence in U.S.-China Trade Relations. This may be because I'm planning a trip to China in a couple of weeks and I don't like turbulence, but makes me think of the relationship is moving along at a very high level and it's hit a really rocky patch. I'm not sure all of us foresaw how rocky it would be. We didn't, in fact. Although, if we look back, as many people have said, contrary to the dominant narrative that everybody had rose-colored glasses on after China's WTO accession, there were many bilateral conversations about tensions in the agreement. So many of the things that we're dealing with now are longstanding tensions. Of course, the Trump administration has simply taken them to a new level and used new, rather blunt tools to deal with them. Okay, so there are three major, I say trade frictions here. They're not primarily, they wander into other areas, but Oh, do you need me to probably use this, right? Okay. So the first is, of course, the bilateral trade deficit, and I'll talk a little bit about that. Our President Trump is fixated on the bilateral trade deficit. Like the stock market, he uses this as some indicator of economic health. Of course, those of us who've been teaching international finance and international trade for years would say that's not necessarily true. That is probably a misplaced obsession. There are other things in the relationship that you should be focused on. The second major trade friction is actually the topic of the Section 301 case against China, which is technology transfer, or more specifically what the U.S. alleges is forced technology transfer, failure to respect intellectual property rights, and industrial subsidies, which all come together in the 301 report and the 301 case. These issues are the legal basis for the tariffs that the president has imposed on Chinese imports to the United States. First, $500 billion in two different batches, and then $200 billion, there, which are now taxed at 10%, but we're supposed to go up to 25% beginning of January. That is where we are now with it. We're having a ceasefire, a stay on the ratcheting up of those tariffs. And the last friction is high-tech trade and investment in national security concerns. And of course, last few weeks we've seen the turbulence on this one really in bold, right, with the arrest of a very prominent Chinese businesswoman, not arrest, detainment. We don't actually know what it is. She's out, I think, on bail or something, so I don't know if that's detainment. You can get bail for detainment. I don't know the exact legal thing. It's been pretty hard to figure out exactly what's going on, but anyway, we know it's a signal that the U.S. is concerned about issues involving technological leakage through Chinese firms, but we'll talk a little bit more about those. So I'll call it high-tech trade and investment in national security concerns. Okay, it's my contention that how we address these concerns will have long-term consequences for the bilateral trade and investment relationship, as well as the security posture. So I'm not a national security expert. I don't even play one on TV. But these issues have forced trade people to deal with the concerns that are coming out of the defense community and intelligence community. And even more profoundly, they force us to think about how trade instruments can be useful or not useful in national security goals. So we'll talk about that at the end. I simply want to signal that we are at a very important and delicate point. Probably people say that. I don't think I've ever really said that before. Maybe after my first child. Yeah, it was very, it was a relationship that was moving ahead. But right now, I think we're really seeing that the world can go in at least two different ways. And which path we choose is extremely important on so many dimensions for our children. Dimensions where international cooperation is really key. Just to mention a few, of course, innovation, the future of biotechnology. So you can think, how many lives are we going to save? Climate change. How many lives will we not destroy by destroying the environment through carbon? Terrorism. So those are just three huge things. China and the United States need to work together on these. These are not problems that stay within a border. These are important transnational issues, and as the two largest economies in the world, obviously, cooperation between the two countries is very important to the outcome. So first, the bilateral trade imbalance. So as we know, the president is fixated on the bilateral imbalance, and that imbalance has in fact been growing rather than decreasing in the last year. I think perhaps President Trump thought it would decrease because of his tax cut, which he hoped would bring more investment back to the United States. I realize there's a contradiction in that, but just go with it, folks. And then, of course, the tariffs, which were meant to disrupt supply chains and bring those activities back to the States. It's been only several months, and I will say in a few minutes that I do think that these tariffs could be disruptive to global supply chains, but certainly not going to happen in 2 months, and it's very unlikely that a lot of that activities will come back to the United States. So we know that the premise for thinking that the bilateral deficit would narrow was never grounded in economic theory. However, we have seen it widen as predicted by economists, and this has raised concern about the future of the relationship and how important this will be in the political calculations as the U.S. Designs policy for China. Now, my contention is the following, that the U.S. will run a deficit with some partners as long as its overall trade is imbalanced. Now, that's a controversial statement, right? If you owe money, you have to owe money to somebody, right? So, and the U.S., with the recent tax cut juicing the economy, is a country that continues to spend more than it earns. So it will have a trade deficit in the foreseeable future. And so it's going to have to run a deficit with somebody. Well, does that have to be China? The answer is no. You can imagine a world where trade taxes or tariffs get so high that the trade between the two countries shut down and the tariff and the deficit just moves someplace else. But short of these kind of draconian scenarios, it's likely that it will be China that has the deficit with the United States, among, let's say, many other countries. China is not alone. We focus on China a lot, but it's clearly not alone. In fact, it's not sometimes even the largest creditor country to the United States. Why is that? And the answer is just simple supply chain geography. China's at the end of a long East Asian supply chain. And what comes out of there are goods that the United States needs and wants. In my own research, I try to document how most of the trade coming from China is intermediates and capital goods. So it's things that go into the U.S. Production, primarily. And another important feature of the relationship is that majority of that trade is processing trade. That means it's made in China under specifications that are designed in the West. These are two big indicators that this is mutually gainful trade. It's mediated by multinational corporations, the largest corporations in the world, and it's not going to be simple to end it. So China's at the end of these supply chains. Unless we continue to take very costly steps to demolish these supply chains, disrupt these supply chains, China will continue to be the one with which we have a bilateral deficit. Okay, here's a picture which just shows the sobering facts. The U.S. current account balance continues to move further into negative territory, as you see on the left. And on the right is the Chinese current account balance. And unbeknownst to many Americans, I think, China is moving to a position of international balance. That is, its current account balance as a share of GDP is heading towards zero. So we could have a China that's imbalanced with the rest of the world, but still have an imbalance with the United States. Perfectly normal. Nothing says that all countries have to have a zero balance with each other. If they did, there would be no trade by definition, right? So we have this situation where pointing China out as a country with a big imbalance is not really going to be valid anymore, and yet the U.S. will continue to have a big deficit. As technology evolves further, and here I'm thinking about the whole next generation of unimaginable inventions that will come from AI, machine learning, Internet of Things. China's share of the U.S. deficit could very well grow and grow very organically, because China has continually, incrementally innovated to become the world's best place for manufacture of a lot of these components, et cetera, that go into, and they're hooked into this longer production chain with the United States, with Japan, with Korea, with the EU. This is just flows in electronics, but you can see the important flows from China back to the United States, as well as the flows from the United States back to China. This organic interrelationship between the regions, North America and East Asia, with the U.S. and China at their centers, is fundamental to the global economy. 35%, and particularly our bilateral relationship, 35% of our imports from China are in one category alone, which is computer and electronic components, 35%. It's again something I don't think the American public fully realizes. So this relationship, these products are vitally important to the relationship, and our complex interconnectedness is important to what? Keeping prices low, having people continually be able to adopt them and use them and productively improve their own activities, even if it's just Twitter surfing. And now with the iPhone, we get our own little message how much screen time we had. I would be ashamed to tell my children how much screen time I've had now that I'm living here the past few months on my own. But does it make me more productive? Well, I'm doing new things. It's really hard for them to measure, right? If I use Twitter and reach a wider audience with my ideas, is that going to show up in GDP? It's not. Might even show a little down, but you know what I mean. So this is important. This relationship has held prices down a lot. You think iPhones are expensive? Wait till it gets hit with the 25% tax, right? Of course, it won't go up by fully 25%, but we're going to see something, right? So it's vitally important. And yet we have had leadership that's been willing to cast aspersions on it, sort of throw it all away this is why I think the market continues to gyrate. They finally got it in their head that this is just not rhetoric of a deal, that some really very, very important things are at risk here. I would say as an aside, I'm not talking at all about distributional issues, which are incredibly tough and extremely important, particularly when we talk about the political response. One of the things that this relationship did is it created enormous profits, enormous wealth. And a lot of that wealth really escaped taxation by national governments in the United States and in China. As we know, both countries experienced increases in inequality over the last 30 years. And in fact, their Gini coefficients are fairly close to each other, surprisingly, given the differences in their systems. So there's this behind the thing. This is a wealth machine. This has been a productivity enhancing machine, but it hasn't been beneficial to everybody. Here is some proof from my statement that U.S. imports reflect multinational supply chains. And this is information that we have calculated directly from China customs records with the help of Hong Shengzhang, who is a former student of mine, is now at Zhejiang University. If you look at the red bar, those are exports from China to the United States only. So we separated out from their exports to all destinations. And Chinese exports to the United States look very different than its exports to Kenya. So it's important to take these out. Look, and what you see is that even by 2014, after 2 decades of celebrating the incredible growth and productivity of Chinese domestic firms, we still have 60% of Chinese exports to the United States being mediated by foreign invested companies operating in China. This is because the supply chain trade is so important to the relationship. So it's Foxconn, it's other types of assemblers operating in China, perhaps from Malaysia, from any place where China would get its foreign direct investment. It's Korean subsidiaries that are receiving, special screens, special glass from Korea, and transforming it into. It is Japanese companies producing auto parts in China and shipping them back to the United States. It's 60% of the trade. So it's really very different than I think the public is aware of. So just to recap the first part, trade imbalances are going to remain a problem. The U.S. will run a deficit with some partners, as long as our overall trade is unbalanced. And China is at the end of the long supply chains, and therefore it's likely that U.S. China trade will remain unbalanced unless the United States imposes costly trade barriers in an attempt to force these activities back to the United States. Those activities won't come back to the United States, as we're seeing they'll go to other parts of East Asia or perhaps even Mexico. The second thing I wanted to talk about was the Section 301 case, and in particular, Chinese practices toward intellectual property. There are 4 main sections of the Section 301 report. I'll just go through them very briefly, and then I only want to talk about one. The first is the contention that China forces American companies into joint ventures as a way to steal or gain access to American technology. The second is that U.S. companies are paid too little for their for licensing of their technology. The third is that China engages in predatory outward investment. That is, it would buy companies in the West simply to obtain the technology, destroy the company, and then take that back, almost like a dragon coming out, eating, taking it back to the lair. And then fourth, that China state sponsors cyber theft of U.S. intellectual property. So I'm only going to talk about the first. On number two, licensing, the United States has brought a case at the WTO, which is where it belongs, and we will follow that as it makes its way through that. Hopefully there will be a WTO and an appellate body there. Right now we hear that, interestingly enough, the appellate judges, there's only two left, China and the United States, who will rotate the chairmanship there. The third is that China engages in predatory outward investment, and we've recently had revisions to the U.S. law regarding monitoring and judgments about inward foreign investment. The Foreign Investment Risk Review Modernization Act, I think I've got that right, FIRMA. So, and that is moving along. Those changes are working their way through the bureaucracy to have hopefully doable and not overreaching rules. But that has been separated. We have a different track for responding to this. Lastly, the state-sponsored cyber theft. Clearly, tariffs are not going to get at that. And there has been consistent high-level negotiations, most recently under the Obama administration, which people felt led to some beneficial changes in these practices. Many people argue that those practices have now been reestablished. That doesn't rule out the fact that high-level negotiations could again make a difference, as well as clearly law enforcement. If you go to the FBI website, it's kind of a fun thing to do. You can see that there are all kinds of cases being brought by the United States against domestic spying and industrial spying. Some of those are by Americans, but many of them are also by foreign nationals, including Chinese foreign nationals. So it's right out there for everybody to see how it's done. So these three are addressed properly through alternative channels and are being addressed through alternative channels, despite the fact that they're part of this 301. 301 was like, let's just throw in all the complaints and see what happens. The first, forced technology transfer, is an important issue because it is covered under trade agreements and therefore it may be considered properly the territory for trade. You know, the interesting thing is that for about 20 years, it's been no secret about who brought what to what I call the JV party. Okay, you know, you go to a party, you bring the wine, I bring the beer, you bring the punch, right? So, you know, if you go to documents, say Cornell Law School, Anderson Consult, various places that advised clients over the years, it was very clear that they said, you know, the Americans will bring the technology and Chinese will provide labor and land, and there may be some deals that you can cut here. Now, when we think about it, oftentimes there was no market either for the technology. It was not being sold openly. You couldn't go to somewhere and just say, what's the price of this particular process? And there's also no market for Chinese land. So the Americans say, well, our technology is worth $5 billion. And the Chinese say, well, that's surprising because this acre of land is worth $5 billion. So we went through this dance for years. And some people played that game well. They had good advisors. And some American companies entered successfully and made lots of money. And other parties really just didn't. They felt ripped off. They had bad experiences. We know there's lots of examples of both. So this idea of what I call pay for play is not new. It's been around for a long time. It worked for a long time. We didn't see big increases. In fact, we saw more and more foreign investment going into China, particularly following the WTO accession. My own work deals with not Chinese restrictions, not the vinegar as I call it, but the honey. That is that China over time moved many sectors into so-called encouraged sectors. And those encouraged sectors are eligible for lots of different deal sweeteners, mainly to lower the fixed cost of entry. So is this unusual? No. We can think about the Amazon HQ2 deal that all Virginia taxpayers will be enjoying for quite a few years henceforth, right? So here's from our work. We look at the Chinese catalog, the guidance for foreign direct investment, which is text. Then we code it to particular industries. The particular coding that we're using is derived from a paper by Sheng and Young, which was published in the Journal of Development Economics in 2014. They look at a different aspect of these policies. We're interested in them as drivers of foreign investment to China. Did China end up as the world's factory or even the world's electronics hub by accident? No, it has many natural advantages, and those were, in fact, enhanced through policy. So if you look here, the green part at the top are the share of four-digit sectors that are encouraged by the Chinese government. And by 2010, there's 60% are encouraged. Blue is just neutral. You can enter however you wish. Forbidden, is the red at the bottom. There's very few: nuclear, tobacco. They're really not controversial at all. And then the yellow and the sort of violet there are things where there are JV restrictions. The yellow is complete restriction. In the violet, some activities are restricted. You can see that it's a very small share. Today, there's really only two sectors where JV is required. Now, I should say, and I should have said, this is just in manufacturing. I'm going to turn to services in a minute. So mainly aircraft and autos, and we know that the automobile restrictions are in the process of being lifted and should be lifted within the next 5 to 10 years. Well, 5 years, really. She said a pretty ambitious thing. And then we're already seeing the decline in restrictions in electronic vehicles. So in the manufacturing sector in particular, the U.S. is looking at a policy that is largely going away. So this is not the right place, I think, to bet the farm. If we look just here on high-tech sectors in manufacturing, only 10% had equity caps. That's the blue line at the top. You see it was, about 20%, and it goes down to 10% by 2007. The vast majority of them are actually encouraged. So, did I not have, I had a slide on services. Let me just see. What's changed? Okay. Now, the incentives that I'm talking about may actually be inconsistent with WTO obligations. And it's complicated. This is not an easy aspect of international treaties, and it's something that we really haven't pursued because it has benefited both parties. Maybe not everyone involved, but in general. So FDI policy often embeds performance requirements as a condition for entry. And these conditions for entry, you do X, are usually rewarded with investment incentives. So, for example, with Amazon, you have to hire a certain number of workers. If you do, you won't pay property tax for 25 years, or whatever it is they gave them. The actual deals are not transparent, as they are not in the United States oftentimes. You have to file Freedom of Information Act and other things to find out about a lot of these deals here in the U.S. So it's even more murky in China. These performance requirements, what I call PR, are widely used to promote industrialization, import substitution, exports, technology, transfer of technology, etc., in many developing countries, not only China. This has been a subject of continual dialogue within the WTO system since the Uruguay round. TRIMS agreements cover only a subset of performance requirements, specifically those related to trade. So it's limited in its scope, local content, trade balancing requirements, and import or export restrictions. There's another part of the WTO agreements that may also impact on this area, which is China's accession agreement with the United States, which explicitly rules out technology transfer as a condition for entry approval. But conditioned on proving entry, you can still, under the agreement, although this could be the subject of a WTO dispute, offer incentives for entering in a particular form. But as we've seen, FDI is mainly entering as wholly owned foreign subsidiaries, and the requirements, de jure requirements at least, are gone, mostly gone. Now, what changed to make this a big issue in the United States? I think it's changes in the competitive landscape. Some Chinese observers have pointed them out. Americans have been unwilling, I think, to fully acknowledge that Chinese domestic firms are better competitors than they used to be. Imitation and innovation combined with industrial subsidies have also led to overcapacity. We saw this particularly in the solar industry, where China imitated that mainly through repatriation of top scientists. So China has many, many tools in its industrial policy arsenal. One is so-called intellectual returnees. Nothing wrong with that. Very smart strategy. I wish we were a little smarter about keeping our brilliant students here in the United States. But it has led to overcapacity, bankruptcies in other countries, very noticeable politically, and that has really hurt the relationship. The second, of course, is Made in China 2025, which really sounded an alarm bell for the West. It spread fear that China will use industrial subsidies to raise up its own competitors. It will use foreign investors badly and then lock them out of the market when they've had their way with them, right? And lastly, service sector barriers remain high. So, for example, a key issue in the 301 as well as in reality is so-called cloud computing and business services, where American companies are not able to operate except with a joint venture partner, domestic partner, where the domestic partner essentially is the only one that really touches and stores the data. And so you're basically like a puppeteer pushing on something for somebody else who's doing it. Big source of conflict. It's also very contrary to America's growing comparative advantage in these services. If you look at, for example, some of the big tech companies and where they're getting their revenue, IBM, Hewlett-Packard, enterprises, et cetera, you find that hardware is a very small part, and business services are rising, and profits from there are the mainstay of these sectors. So not being able to sell those services into China is a big problem. But of course, when we're there, we get right into the third point I want to make, which is about national security. Lastly, I just want to say about IP, if it was just about IP, we could have a deal. The costs of Chinese leniency on intellectual property theft are beginning to be outweighed by the benefits of tightening up. Not only are they becoming inventors themselves, but we're seeing that these concerns are shared by Japan, Korea, almost all of its trading partners. So it's time for it to go. It could be negotiated away. We know that the legal architecture within China is already changing as China grasps for institutional ways to deal with this issue. So if it's just that, it's negotiable. Why is it not going to be easy? And the reason is because security concerns about tech supply. If U.S. comparative advantage is in these business services and other types of services, and these services are increasingly linked to national security, it's going to be very hard to find a peaceful, cooperative way forward. So we see three different categories of conflict. One is allegations of sales of U.S. components to China that are then forwarded to what I call U.S. designated bad guys. So we see this in the ZTE case and the Huawei case very clearly, that we sold you components, we have export controls on these, but through you they got to the bad guys and you are complicit in this. The second sort is Chinese sales to the U.S. is seen as a security threat. Right before Vice President Mike Pence's new Cold War speech, we saw mysterious reports of hidden chips in servers that were destined for the United States. Found the timing greatly concerning of those reports, but nevertheless it shows the type of arguments that are being made. Backlash against Chinese involvement in 5G networks, and then last, concern about Chinese involvement in the Internet of Things, which is huge because the Internet of Things would be things like your toaster, the thing that controls the heat on your house. You know, we're supposed to come in and everything's supposed to happen, right? And China needs to have a role in those devices, and yet if we think that one piece in that device can bring down the entire network or can be used to spy on people, we will end up in a place where there'll be a bifurcated world. So these tensions will be increasingly heightened by the fact that China is itself an innovator rather than just part of the supply chain. A fear that I've heard is, video sharing software, very cheap video sharing software, plus combined with AI and spying. Young servicemen all over the world use video sharing services that are Chinese, and they're taking videos of themselves on American bases. This has become a rallying cry that they should not have access to these. So we're seeing that many aspects of our daily life are now becoming subject to these concerns about national security. A lot of ominous music in the background. We don't know how much is real, how much is not real. Everybody wants national security, but we also know there's a very important component or cost to increasing constraints in these areas, which is sort of killing the big fat tech goose. Okay, just to recap on the third point, thorny problems are going to remain outside the trade realm, and these will impact on the trade realm. Chinese cooperation on the main U.S. complaints. I think if China, and so far up until the recent detainment of the Canadian diplomat, we have a new tit for tat going on there. Up until that point, China has been very steadfast and very restrained in terms of its behavior, and trying to say to the rest of the world, we're open for business no matter what's going on with the United States. We still remain a great place for you to invest and to be part of your supply chains. That was the message. In a country that has some difficulty getting its message out, I think its actions spoke very loudly. But that will, if they were able to maintain that and solve this problem and then go ahead and improve intellectual property protections, as I think they want to and can do, it would bring more investment to China, not less. And it would drive up probably the trade deficit for the reasons that I said. It's at the end of these supply chains. And then the U.S. tech security issues would be increasingly brought to the forefront by those groups who are mainly concerned with that. So I'll just end with his thought. No matter where the so-called trade truce that we're in holds or not, it will not be all quiet on the Western Front for China. We are going to see trade tensions for quite a while, and these issues are not ones that lend themselves to easy solutions. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Lovely, for that wonderful talk. I learned at USTR that nobody is clean, including ourselves, and some of the mirrors that you held up to us were striking. For example, the role of U.S. states in providing investment incentives, the role of states and even cities imposing Buy America restrictions and so forth. But I will tell you one quick story. In addition to the obsession with bilateral balances that President Trump has and that Professor Lovely mentioned, there's a mercantilist corollary, which is exports are good and imports are bad. So during the first Clinton administration, when I was in USTR, the then USTR, Mickey Cantor, who had been Clinton's campaign manager, went to Seattle and gave his standard speech about trade. Exports, Clinton's policy means exports. Export industries pay higher wages. Exports, exports. And finally someone raised their hand and said, excuse me, Mr. Cantor, this is the port of Seattle. We have stevedores and truckers and insurance people, logistics companies, retail, all dependent on imports. And not only that, when you think of the role of imports in keeping inflation down and providing clothes for poor people and so forth, this is just part of our narrative that just doesn't get mentioned. And I'm also glad you mentioned services, because we are the #1 service exporter, and we have something like a $40 billion surplus with China in the field of services. Now, we're opening up to discussion. At some point, I hope to hear from my longtime friend, Sourabh Gupta. But meanwhile, all of you must have questions for our speaker, and please raise your hand and speak up, identify yourself, challenge her if you like, offer your own personal experience. Somebody has to be first. Otherwise, I'm going to call on Sourabh, but let's hear from someone. Sourabh.
Let me just emphasize 2 points that Professor Lovely had mentioned. The point about the incredibly important role of FIEs. We are coming to the 40th, the foreign invested enterprises. We are coming to the 40th anniversary of the reform and opening up. Of course, the FIEs didn't come in right at that point of time. They came in the late 80s onwards. But I'm talking now from China's perspective and useful lessons at the Chinese end. You know what the Chinese did really well was tell all foreign invested enterprises, come to China, set up shop out here. We will try to be create as enabling a business environment, and just export out, produce for the market wherever, etc. The main intention, though, of course, was that using China's labor-intensive human capabilities to export those goods abroad. And foreign invested enterprises came to China, and that's precisely what they did. And part of what the Chinese government's the brilliance of that was it didn't create too many restrictions upon these people as the way they wanted to. Of course, it was restricted to the special economic zones, etc., etc., etc. But what thereafter happened is that as they set up their supply chains in China, progressively over 25 years, China, a bigger chunk of the supply chain was located and sourced. The inputs, the parts and components were sourced from China, to the point today that we have that China has essentially the lock on most low and medium technology manufacturing industries. I mean, you need to have a China strategy. And here's the lesson for China going forward for the next 30 years. Liberalize the foreign investment regime. Just the liberalizations of the 1980s, late 1980s, were of the trading regime. China has already begun to liberalize its investment regime, as we saw on the slides, but have full or as much as possible liberalization of your foreign investment regime, so that many of these American technology-enabled companies find it in their interest to set up shop in India, in China, can retain their intellectual property, and then produce for the Chinese market or produce for the global market. And what will happen is that gradually over a period of time, a lot of that supply chain related to high-tech industries also will be located in China. I mean, more and more parts and components will be sourced in China, to the point China might even have a lock on high-tech manufacturing. It might not be the leader in many or some of the high-tech segments, but no company worth it, high-tech company worth its salt, can say that we do not have a China strategy, manufacturing strategy in the high technology segment, and hope to prosper. And in that way, we will have the interdependence that we've had so far, again replicated in the high technology industries. But for that to happen, the essential basic requirement is that Western or foreign companies or even Japanese companies which set up shop in China can come in through the 100% subsidiary route and can retain their full intellectual property. And that's why the faster we can move beyond this joint venture requirement, which foreign companies feel kind of muscles some of their intellectual property through an implicit, not a de jure process, I think the better it will be for all parties involved, and I think it will work well for China.
So just to clarify, because of the size of the Chinese market, these companies, a lot of companies are going to stay there. Even though Chinese wages have been rising, and in the lower tech industries, Southeast Asian countries have been picking up some of the business anyway. I mean, do you not worry that the party cells in these companies are getting more, are being required, that there's more ideological indoctrination, there's more concern of young Chinese not to be branded as in the pay of foreigners? I mean, there's some negative political currents here that would work, I would think, against what you just painted.
Yes.
The whole the social scores and a lot of that stuff is daunting for, I think, Western companies looking to set up shop there.
The social, you said the social
scores.
Social credit scoring.
Oh, yes.
That way.
A lot of that is, I think, troubling for people who are looking to go there.
Yeah, and if in the climate of uncertainty, you know, China's growth is slowing down, it may not look very good, contrary to what you just said. Yeah, go ahead. And then you after that.
Sure. The only thing I would say is China would be better served by moving up the technology ladder in terms of providing higher value-added manufacturing And considering that it is becoming one of the huge capital exporters to the world, it's better actually that many of the lower tech industries actually move to the Bangladesh, to Africa, to Vietnam.
Surely
And
that's
so
been happening already. I mean,
it's happening, and
the
it's
toys
it's-
and the umbrellas and plastic
Sure
sandals
enough.
and so on
Yeah.
have
Of
moved,
course,
and
the-
the higher value added,
Yeah.
depending on the product, of course. But China's been moving up the value added
Fair
ladder
enough.
steadily.
The party cell issue, of course, is it's a slightly separate issue, but it's obviously impinges on this, whether whatever technology, wherever you are on the technology ladder. But you know, it's something which scares Westerners, but we've not yet seen the effects of it to that extent in terms of it being a really fouling the business environment as such, or that the party cells actually being dictating anything as such from a business perspective.
Before I
it,
pick
but
on you, do you want to comment on anything on this?
No, I mean, recently I have looked at export shares, global export shares, to see if we can pick up the fact that businesses, certain industries are moving off of China. So last summer I was in Vietnam. It's now Nike's single biggest production site, and but it's very hard to find in the data. We hear it all the time, but a country like Vietnam is just so small compared to China, that if anything in China's global market share has maybe plateaued. It's very hard to find negative numbers in this. So yeah, we think it's happening, it is happening, but market's been growing such that China still. We do know, however, that in the midst of this huge growth, there's been the shift toward the high tech. As you said, it has been moving up the chain of comparative advantage, and obviously MIC 2025 is all about that. The idea that the only way to guarantee, that you can have 10% real wage growth, which China has enjoyed for quite a while, is to do things faster and smarter, and that's going to require better technology. So,
Gentleman in the back row, you had your hand up? No, that's you, yes.
We have a question. First, thank you very much for the wonderful talk, especially for Professor Lovely. Read your every tweet, retweet, like on tweets.
Thank you.
It's the first time to listen to your presentation. By the way, I'm Jean Ma from
oh, Gene, hi, so nice to meet you.
You know each other electronically?
I know his reputation.
No, my question is I want to know what's the risk and to what extent the things will escalate or spread to other sectors, especially the financial sector. So, for example, just this morning I had a phone call with investment bank in China. They want to apply for a broker-dealer license in the US. Should I tell them forget about it, no chance? Or if you get a license, New York agent will go after you? So what's the chance for this dispute to spread over to other sectors?
I have an answer. Why don't you
So
try
far,
first?
it's not touched.
So far, it hasn't. We saw in the last week things take a different turn, and we hope that they can pull this back from the brink. I know here in Washington, many groups are saying that they might not go to China this year, which would be a huge loss in terms of the relationships that have been established in academia, in finance, all throughout important sectors. So, yeah, I would say come, but we don't know.
I'll just take this conversation back to a time to earlier this year, not just to the period earlier this year, or rather to the period before 1 week back with these arrests. And the main the grievance of the U.S. side has been that our entry regulations, entry barriers are so low, your entry barriers are so high. What aggravated the frictions was the fact that because of those entry barriers, Chinese companies could come in, and deep-pocketed companies could come in and in the US's view, poach high technology, and comparable US companies could not do that in China. One of the early liberalizations that we saw this year by President Xi was in banking and in insurance. And the main point I'm getting to is that the US was saying it's an unlevel playing field. If that playing field becomes more level, I actually see from a medium-term perspective, this will actually tamp down tensions. I think the fundamental drivers of U.S. policy and anger, which the Trump administration has taken to an extreme level, is that tilted and unfair playing field. And that is partly to do with the fact that some sectors, the access you don't have, you cannot enter as easily, like as is the case with finance. But finance has been, in this year and going forward, I assume, one of the sectors which is being liberalized, and liberalized in a big way. So the more equality there is and reciprocity there is, I think is a good thing, and will actually help bring tensions down. Of course, now with this 1 week having passed, things might turn out differently, but I think as a general principle, reciprocity will help rather than hurt.
Yes.
John Lee from Georgetown University. A few questions. One is, you have pointed out, Professor Lovely pointed out that there's a divergent interest between the business circle and the national security circle. So is that going to, would you elaborate more on that? So is that going to be a deeper divide between these two circles because their interests are so different in the long term and the medium term? Second question is, we see this cyclicals, the cycles, in terms of political, in terms of business, economic, and social development in the United States. And there's also arguably a cycle between, in the relationship between China and the U.S. So which part of this cycle are we now in at this moment? And where are we going to, where is going to develop into the scenario in the future? Thank you.
Wow, those are hard questions.
Get
Thank
the
you for
crystal
your
ball
questions.
quickly.
The division between business interests and national security is right now more muted than one might like. And I think part of it might go back to your statement about reciprocity. When we would think that a company like an IBM or a Hewlett Packard would be pushing the government to maintain openness, it's muted now if they believe that their ability to really expand market access within China is basically going to be blocked. And if they're relegated to a role where they can only have sort of a non-controlling interest in a JV to provide services indirectly through their partner, if they're only doing maintenance and software and hardware sales, which are a decreasing share of their overall activity, their enthusiasm for engaging in that type of political pressure is gone. It diminishes. And I think that's what we're seeing. And people in the United States have been trying to tell China that the business community has been a very important force for the relationship. Now, if China opens up, there's still the issue very hard about these national security concerns. They're on both sides. China also has many national security concerns, which is why they don't want, why they're not letting foreign companies into cloud computing, among other things. So how do we separate out what is their domestic industrial strategy from what is legitimate national security concerns? What does legitimate national security concern even mean in a world where President Trump is threatening auto tariffs on Japan under national security? So this is all up for grabs. It's nothing we've ever seen before. And it's very worrying because it will impact the political constituencies that have been a driving force in liberalization and integration. So I don't know where, I do know one thing, national security trumps profits. Not many things trump profits, but national security does.
I want to elaborate on that a bit, if I might. I spent 4 years in the Pentagon, and I have an affiliation now with the China program and National Defense University, although I don't do a lot with them. And I've always taken a broader definition of national security and the links between economic and security issues. A couple of quick comments. I mean, this treating our allies as a threat to national security, of course, does enormous damage to our foreign policy and the credibility of our security commitments. One reason the Trump people took this path is that there's no, national security is always exempted from trade rules. The United States always says we go along with rule XYZ except national security. And unlike the WTO appellate process or dispute settlement process, there's no process for judging whether someone's national security claim is legitimate or not. No one will allow their own definition of national security to be judged by somebody else. So it's sort of anarchy, and it's a very easy way to take a 232 case and say, you know, you're a threat to national security. I guess my other comment is has to do with sort of the broader strategic context or the broader political context. I've just been with some Europeans, and not only do they have a lot of the same concerns with it, and they're sort of waking up to this rather slowly, I have to say, but they're probably going to have some of their own CFIUS mechanism. Right now, there's very little, and it's a couple countries are doing this, but there's nothing like our process. And that's one of the pushbacks I see. And I mean, another pushback is that the criticism of China's debt diplomacy, as they call it, the Sri Lanka port, and where, you know, there's a debt for equity swap sort of at the end of this. That's one. The South China Sea, they may have overplayed their hand a little bit in the South China Sea, and now we're getting this pushback that we've all been talking about. So I wonder, who knows, but Xi Jinping is a very rational character, and I wonder whether maybe he and his colleagues are sort of going to be a little bit more conciliatory than they would otherwise be, given that they could face a nationalist reaction inside China. They don't have, it may be a dictatorship, but they have to pay attention to public opinion. But nevertheless, I see a sort of a different kinds of pushback beginning to develop, and I wonder if that might shape what China's willing to do in the areas that we've been talking about today.
Can I just jump in on the national
Yeah.
security question? You know, in terms of national security, the considerations with regard to Chinese investments in the U.S., and that's what the CFIUS upgrade, which was just done, was basically placed a scanner on, Chinese investments, including minority positions in early stage U.S. technology companies, which might have national security considerations. That is policed. It is administered. It's an interagency body, but it's administered by Treasury. But Treasury, among all the various U.S. government agencies, has been and continues to be the most forthcoming in terms of its engagement with China. Even in the course of the FIRMA discussions with Congress, the Treasury insisted and got its way that economic competitiveness considerations would not inform these sort of decisions. It would be strictly related to national security, but of course Commerce Department will now be able to step in to determine what are emerging and foundational technologies and whether they need to be controlled from a national security perspective. Point being, Treasury has considered national security through a very narrow definition, not an expansive definition of national security, which is a good thing. Of course, that process might be now going a little bit into reverse, because we now have, of course, these prosecutions happening. Justice Department has gotten into the fray, and those technologies which might have been allowed because they're not really in that narrow definition of national security, Justice Department might come through a sanctions route and say, but these companies also are also not allowed to sell their technology to China. So that definition might get broadened through a different route. But my point here is Treasury has been most forthcoming. It's drawn the definition narrowly. Of course, it will have to administer it, and we hope it administers it narrowly. But if China can show itself to be forthcoming also in terms of liberalization of its investment regime, and that it is not, at least from a public perspective, seen as engaging in predatory acquisitions, that the evaluation and interpretation of national security might still remain very narrow, and Treasury will lead the process. And so that could actually enable and help the process. So we shouldn't be too scared right now that, I know Trump did 232 and national security widened to everything under the sun, but I'm hoping that because this is such an important area and there's so much money to be made for both sides, that Treasury will still be very liberal in the way it moves forward.
So
in
just
this
to
regard.
clarify, Sourabh, when you say you hope it remains narrow, you mean you hope that the CFIUS process led by Treasury won't include competitiveness, but even if you stick to national security and leave out competitiveness, there's still a difference between what I used to call things that go bang, that is things that are on the State Department's munitions list, versus things that are dual use, administered by the Commerce Department's commodity control list. And I think I do sort of favor a broadening of that kind, agreeing with you about competitiveness being left out. But so by narrow, you would allow for a somewhat broader definition of national security concerns, but always within national security and not competitiveness. Is that what you mean?
Yes, economic competitiveness, it would not be the consideration, because then Congress can jump into the fray and expand that definition indefinitely, frankly, and that's the real fear. And that definition, of course, will have certain competitiveness elements, but it will be informed by the fact that these are not items which can be weaponized in some way, in whatever shape, as in systems or subsystems. And of course, technology is so complex. I'm hardly in a position to referee this debate, and so we don't know how that will be this thing. But but it's not that every chip or every component, electronic component which is made today will necessarily have a very dynamic national security component to it. And as long as that is just administered and interpreted narrowly, I think that leaves ample scope then for licensing and for two-way trade in those technologies. But China, from its end, needs to show that it is just as open in this. It all comes down again to that point of reciprocity, as reciprocal as possible.
It's interesting to compare all of this period with the U.S.-Japan, the Japan bashing phase in the 80s that I lived through, where the corporate community, by the way, was much more united in favor of open trade and investment with Japan than the corporate community is today. But if you will recall, most of you are probably not old enough, but the Fujitsu Fairchild case was very dramatic. And there again, that shows you how hard it is to keep competitiveness out of the picture, because a lot of the cases, like there was a Toshiba case that really was a military concern, but some of the other cases really were, we don't want to give away our integrated circuit business. Motorola was leading a charge against Japan and trying to use every CFIUS tool and other tools it could. So it gets very political very fast. More comments and questions? Yes.
I think for American businesses considering going to China, it is a question of how likely are you to be able to really make a profitable long-term business there, because it is there's a lot of challenges and now so much uncertainty, and I think that is, if liberalization is clearly in the cards, I do believe that's best for China. There's no way they're going to be nibbled at the bottom by Vietnam and India and Bangladesh, and you can't. They are kind of, I think, a mid-range economy now, not a first-tier developing economy. So they have to grow. They need to grow up and out, and I think for many American business people, they're looking at that thinking, what's the downside? How bad could it go there? I have.
It's the Chinese.
I was of the age that I saw the Japanese situation, but I wasn't much of a decision maker then. But I think I'm much more spooked by the control in China. The perception was there's a pretty solid legal structure that will protect the business in Japan, I think, much more than we perceive in China right now. At least me as a business.
Are you in the corporate world now?
I am.
Yeah, good.
So
would
I
you
would be like the guy looking to whether to go to China or not.
Well, you might be the. We might get into abduction, reciprocal abduction, we call it. Would you like to comment here? You're the star.
Well, I think there's things we can learn by comparison to the U.S. Japan trade tensions of the 80s, but there's also important differences. And clearly the fact that, the military relationship, the defense umbrella over Japan, U.S. Does not have the same relationship with China. differences in the basic systems, how we view human rights, how we view privacy. Unfortunately, the U.S. has been very slow to define privacy, to define itself and what it believes, and this is I think part of the problem. Obviously, if they did define it and it was so extreme that there was no room for continued interaction, it would be bad. But the U.S. has a lot of work to do in this area, regardless of the flaws that many people find in the European data privacy rules. They're at least out there with them, and the rest of the world's reacting to them.
They're stronger than ours.
Yeah, they are stronger than ours. So, you know, we have a lot to deal with there, I think.
I was told that the privacy issue is the single biggest obstacle to a transatlantic trade agreement, and TTIP. I'm not saying TTIP is a good idea necessarily, but their attitude is that the person who generates the data owns the data, and the American attitude is if it's out there, the companies can harvest it. It's a fairly big difference.
Again, on this point, it's actually, let me link both the privacy issue in a different context and the issue of the business operating environment out there. Because as Professor Lovely talked about, she talked in terms of performance requirements, and those are illegal as per China's WTO accession protocol. And Section 301 report states very plainly, China is de jure. I mean, we have no case to bring against China. China's practices are de jure, inconsistent with its obligations, but the great issue has been how its policies are consistent with its obligations, how its business practices are with regard to those policies, and that's the area where there has been great amount of disappointment. And I'm assuming that was at the crux of the President Xi Trump discussions out there in terms of reforming those practices rather than policies. Because policies, of course,
the policies aren't so bad, but practices.
Exactly.
Well,
it's
enforcement.
It's the enforcement and the practices, and also, you know, when it comes into I'll tell you, when it comes to say a joint venture, you don't have a controlling share, and it's the joint venture, Chinese joint venture party who has to get the approvals. So the joint venture party has all the details, documents in the approval process. Now consider that Chinese joint venture, that Chinese partner also has an independent independent operation in that same industry competing with that joint venture. Now, how are you to feel relaxed about the fact that your information? So it's those issues. But here's a potential solution which I could think of, and here comes the privacy issue. You know, the privacy issue has EU and the US have agreed to disagree on privacy, and they have something called Privacy Shield. And who administers Privacy Shield? They have an ombudsperson's office within the State Department which takes complaints from the EU side in this regard and actions it on a much quicker basis. And that could be a sort of solution for this issue with regard to practices. What if we have an ombudsperson right up in the State Council, Council next to Vice Premier Liu He's office, who takes these complaints immediately from US business and acts on it rather than wait for a strategic and economic dialogue to act on it 6 months down the line?
I'm in food, and compliance is a big issue in China. Like, you know, the standards are no problem, but they've obviously had a lot of problems with compliance in food that scares actors in the West.
The subject of state-owned enterprises has come up indirectly, at least, especially when one of them is competing with a foreign firm. And I know you've done some work on SOEs, and I wondered if you see trends. Are they're still getting subsidies? Some of these dinosaur companies. Do you see any signs that the promised reforms in this area are advancing? Can you say something about those?
Well, you know, Nick already has a new book coming out focusing on the investment skewing towards state-owned enterprises. And with the stimulus that the Chinese pursued after the global financial crisis, a lot of that was investment driven, and it went into the state-owned enterprises. So we have seen a resurgence of the state-owned enterprises. Many people view that as negative for China's economic growth. In fact, Nick estimates that it takes off about 2 percentage points of Chinese growth. So instead of growing at, say, 7, they could easily grow at 9. So contrary to the rhetoric that China's hitting this middle-income slump, they actually, if they pursued different policies, could grow faster than they are now. So that's one thing. How are they competing with foreign firms inside China? I think it's very specific to particular industries, and state has controlling interests or important interests in many industries that aren't necessarily wholly, state-owned. They're not identified clearly as state-owned enterprises. It's not hidden either. I mean, we do know, just like here, ownership can be cloaked through subsidiary and holding company structures. There are those same things, but it really goes down, I think, in a lot of these to market access, something we haven't talked about. But there are still many non-tariff barriers to American companies entering, and these have also been used as a pretty invisible form of industrial policy. So an example might be biochemicals. Perhaps it's impossible for an American firm to be licensed to operate in this area, while China has been pursuing its own innovation or development of its of a state-connected firm. And then China may just prefer to go buy a company outside and get the technology that way. So this has been a problem for some of our higher tech companies getting into China. We don't see it as there's no tariff there. You just can't get licensed to operate. Yeah, this goes down into standards and China has a legitimate right to make sure that anybody who comes in who's selling things that are going to be used in a variety of different ways is actually safe and appropriate for the market. But this can be used as a way to prevent market access. So, again, this is an important issue. It's clearly one where American businesses see that, it's hurting them, but it is negotiable. I think originally the Chinese said that of the huge list that was given to them back in the spring, about 40% could be easily done, 40% were negotiable, and 20% were simply just not going to ever happen. So, I think we really have to get that 80%. Some of it's low-hanging fruit, some of it's a little higher-hanging fruit. And where there's fundamental disagreements, maybe we're just going to have to agree that this is not going to happen. There's not going to be free trade in every sector. It's just not going to happen because of national security and other types of concerns. Fundamental to that, and you talked several times about reciprocity. I've talked about negotiation. Fundamental is trust. One of the problems we're having now is that the trust between the two partners has eroded, and it's continuing to erode with the recent arrests. That is very negative. It's very hard to reach a solution with someone, or as President Xi would say, get to win-win when there's no trust. And this is where I particularly am concerned about people not making trips to China, Chinese not coming here to study or coming here to visit, particularly in the scientific community, the academic community, our students. These are things which over the years have built tremendous trust. These are vitally important for us to reach a peaceful solution on so many of these issues and to reach a negotiated outcome that I think would benefit both countries. How do we reestablish that trust?
You touched on innovation. I want to follow up, but any questions or comments here? Yes, go ahead.
Well, it's sort of more asking you guys to get your crystal ball out again, I suppose, but obviously we're in the ceasefire that is slated to possibly end sometime in the spring. At that point, we're going to go back to sort of a standoff in terms of these trade lists, and I was just curious what you guys see happening at that time. And I know it's like almost impossible to predict, but if you see any sort of way forward from there in terms of negotiations or changes to tariffs.
You want to go first?
Thank you. You're so sweet. Well, yeah. I think we all have that. I would say the fact that Ambassador Lighthizer is now the head of this is a good sign, because I think, he's a skilled negotiator, whether you like or don't like what he comes out with.
He knows what he's talking about. He's a pro.
Yeah, and he gets to a deal. We may not all like the U.S. MCA, but they did reach a deal. In the end, they reached. So we hope that they get to a deal. So that, I think, is a good sign. We don't know what else will be happening politically in the United States, and I think we know that ultimately the president is quite mercurial to say the least.
Put it mildly.
So, that's what makes the the confidence interval on this point estimate very, very wide.
I mean, the idea that we could make China alter its basic industrial policy is just fantasy, just fantasy. And as Professor Lovely said, it's getting to be in China's own interest to protect intellectual property. So you could take something like IP and claim it as this huge victory, thereby satisfying Trump and his base. I mean, I suspect there'll be a lot of cosmetic promises and changes and so forth. But you really don't know about that. I really can't say.
Can I jump in on this
Yeah.
one? I'm going to go a little bit on a slightly different line out here, and obviously, given the events of this last 1 week, I mean, there are too many variables to say how this can impact the situation politically. But the one thing I took away from that meeting on December 1st was this: President Xi himself talked for 45 minutes directly, didn't leave it to his delegation members to talk about it. He talked for 45 minutes in terms of what he, as the president of China, was going to do. It was unusual. Leaders like that don't talk in that depth and detail of the commitments. To some extent, now he owns the issue, and he would not have placed himself and his reputation on the line in such a big way with the American president if he didn't have a real plan of action in store. And this 45 minutes really, I mean, Navarro, Lighthizer, Mnuchin have talked about this since coming out, how much they have been struck by that. This is, I think, it's just reading tea leaves, but it's a very, very important factor in my estimate. The other thing I would say is that the U.S. side also has shown a great deal, I would say, of sincerity, starting from Trump's call on October 30th. I mean, the U.S. was all over the place in terms of tariff, you're going to do this, I'm going to do that, etc. But come October 30th, November 1st, their messaging, at least from the key players, has been very consistent. When Navarro actually got out of line, he was shut down immediately at that point of time. And for an administration which is so indisciplined and leaks all the time, that they could have one message on this shows at least that they are willing to deal with this with a very sincere attitude. Now, if how close that can bring the two parties remains to be seen. But I think one should not give up and expect that at the end of 90 days or in the next 6 months, we'll just be reverting back to the status quo or a worse version of the status quo. Keep a little space, reserve a little space that something really good also could potentially happen.
Yes, you had.
Yeah, that's lovely. I mean, I saw one of your slides showing a call.
Could you speak up a little bit, please?
With the Chinese. So do your academic interaction with Chinese scholars on these particular issues, do you see any perception gap between American scholars and Chinese scholars viewing these issues? Because when we talk to scholars from both sides, and it seems to me there's always imbalanced view. Some people view more positively and some people view more negatively. Do your interaction, do you see this gap?
So you say you see a more balanced view or unbalanced? Less balanced. It's hard to know. Here in the States, I feel that there has been a change in the freedom with which Chinese academics speak. That is something that concerns me. I don't think it's good for the Chinese people. I don't think it's good for innovation. I don't think it's good for science. But so I have to think about what happens when I speak to my friends in China. And I think we're all very much aware of what the stakes are. I think everyone knows there are legitimate concerns on both sides. I don't see a big gap in perception between what's happening. Officially, when we have had official delegations, unfortunately we saw a lot of sort of Chinese denial, but not engaging on the actual issues. The United States making very strong pronouncements without a lot of evidence either. So I never thought that these meetings were very productive. Now, as we've heard, where we're having these intense dialogues between the leaders, that will set a different tone. In keeping with what you said, there's also been contact recently at the very highest levels to further this and to push the dialogue along. So this will set, I hope, a pace. So I'm a bit concerned for different reasons on a chilling atmosphere for free speech. But I think it's different. Inside China, I still find that, at least unofficially, we're able to speak. You know, one of the great things is with international education, at least in the economics profession, there's really no difference in my Chinese colleagues and my American colleagues. It's been a wonderful, productive relationship for so long that any change in that relationship, I think, would be very costly for both sides.
I'm hearing similar things. People who've known Chinese scholars for years are suddenly getting the party line and sort of Xi Jinping thought, and then you go out for beer in the evening and maybe they loosen up a bit and tell you what they really think. I think economists, though, are, they tend to think alike, and there are certainly reformers in China. So when people say China thinks or China believes, I want to know, well, who are you talking about? Because there are reformers that would like more market opening, and there are nationalists who think we shouldn't compromise anymore with the U.S. I mean, so there's lots of different people.
I have to say the United States is not completely innocent of this also. It's not to perhaps the same extent where we're all studying Donald Trump thought. That would be a short book, we all know that. But, I think Vice President Pence's speech was very chilling. I personally took it as a warning, not one that I'm heeding very much. But, this idea that if you don't think like the Trump administration does, you've obviously been purchased by a Confucius Institute or something else. This is a very negative thing for a free society, and it will retard our ability to deal with challenges in an open way. So I view that speech as very negative in terms of what it says about our ability to speak with Chinese colleagues openly without being considered to either be stupid, complicit, or traitors. And so both sides need to be concerned about this. In science, as we know, it's very easy to fake results. We've seen it on both sides. So it's perhaps damaging in social science, but people will say, oh, who cares? If the economists did a little less work, maybe the world would be a better place. Oh, no. But this extends to all kinds of things where people have to tell the truth about things. No, the experiment on the cancer drug didn't work out, right? So I see these as negative developments. We in the academic community have to push against that.
Yes, in the very back over there.
Hi, my name is Noah. I'm from the Singapore Embassy.
I
just saw some reporting on the Wall Street Journal this morning about China possibly preparing a replacement for the Made in China 2025 plan. So my question, I don't know
a
whether
replacement for the 2025 plan?
Not a replacement, but yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so I don't know whether it's going to be actual change or just a cosmetic change, but my question is, if you were advising the Chinese government and the planners for this replacement, what are some of the recommendations that you would make so that China could sort of address some of the key U.S. concerns without compromising its main position to transition to a more advanced economy, which is the objective of the Made in China 2025 strategy?
This is probably the last question. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I think that's a great question, and I'm glad to see that this is happening. I think there are several things that concern sort of neutral observers. One is, of course, subsidies, which are very non-transparent. If you're in China, Peterson visited recently, and I had the pleasure of being on that trip, and we were told, oh, it's aspirational. We've all heard it's just aspirational. It's a guidance. It's not. And then you have, various newspapers in China reporting this is a Made in China 2025 project, and the money is coming from this fund. We have this development fund or state sovereign venture capital fund, et cetera. So, more transparency about that. Investment in particular industries is not per se illegal. So there are ways in which China needs to be more transparent and to say, hey, this is part of our legitimate action in terms of our development. That's one. The second is the role of foreign companies, both in terms of serving the Chinese market as exporters and as serving the Chinese market in terms of wholly foreign-owned enterprises operating on Chinese soil. The so-called Green Book that was associated with the MIC 25, but then of course there was some distancing, had market shares for Chinese companies. If you are a market-driven society, the outcome of any contest involving future industries should be unknown. We don't know who will be. You know, we would have thought 30 years ago the Digital Equipment Corporation, which some of you may not even know, right, was an incredibly pioneering company based in Cambridge, Massachusetts, was bought out. It doesn't really exist anymore. We don't know who's going to end up. So these kinds of specific market targets I think really need to go, and we need to say this is going to be the outcome. And this is consistent with some of the official statements in China. Of course we don't know. We welcome foreign participation. So those kind of specific targets, I think I would say, they need to go.
We've just about run out of time, so I'll have final comments from Sourabh and then
Sourabh,
you.
Yep. And on that same question, actually, you know, the crisis that we have right now, it's become a little too aggravated, the frictions. But if it was less, it might not have been a bad timing. You know, the Made in China 2025 itself is part and parcel of the, what was it called, I think, long and medium term science and technology development plan, 2006 to 2020. I think last week they had the first meeting of setting the next 15-year long and medium term science and technology development plan. So this is a good moment to see what are the reforms to be brought into and to make it as internationally digestible as possible. Secondly, President Xi is at the zenith of his political power. If not now, when? This is the time to push it through. And maybe I'll just wrap up with his President Xi's own words at the 19th Party Congress on this specific issue. We will promote high standards, liberalization and facilitation of trade and investment, implement system of pre-established national treatment and plus a negative list across the board, ease market access, further open up services sector, protect legitimate rights and interests of foreign investors, and all businesses registered in China will be treated equally. If we just do that in the next science and technology development plan, I think we'll move a great deal forward.
And enforce those things.
Yeah.
Final comment from you?
No, I'm just happy to find out he was reading that and not saying it from memory. I'm like, wow.
Well, on that note, thank everybody for coming, and thanks to our speakers.
Thank you, Dr. Forrest, for excellent moderation of this great discussion. So in this 90 days window of holding off implementing new tariff, we're going to see more dramas or more uncertainty, or we're going to see real progress. I think we're looking forward to the next round of discussion. And with that, I think with this particular discussion on this topic, we'd like to end. Thank you all for coming to ICAS public events. And with that, please join me in thanking our three panelists. And I wish you have a pleasant trip to China with less turbulence.
Thank you. Yeah, with less turbulence. Yeah.